Hello and welcome to the Sam Fiction and Fantasy Fun podcast. This is episode 3 of the Witcher chapter by chapter book review, where I'll go through a summary of what happened in the last chapter and give my detailed thoughts on it. Today I'll be discussing chapter 3 of book 1, The Last Wish. So really quick, if you're watching the video version of this podcast, basically that's on my YouTube channel. If you didn't know, if you've found this through Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever, there is a video version on my YouTube channel, and my YouTube channel has the same name as the podcast. It's Sam Fiction and Fantasy Fun. And I'm talking about the video because you might see in the video this blanket, and if I move at all during the podcast, you might see it. It's kind of cold in my apartment right now. It's December at the time of recording this, so it is, well, okay, I live in Southern California, so it doesn't get really cold, but it still gets kind of cold. It does get a little bit chilly, and my apartment is definitely chilly. You need blanket when you're just kind of sitting down and not moving. So I have this blanket here, and it's actually a very special blanket. This was handmade by my mom. So anyway, if you see this stuff here, it's this very fine handcrafted blanket. Oh, you know what? This is actually a pretty good test to see if my mom actually listens to my podcasts like she said she would. Is, you know what? She's not a fan of The Witcher. She doesn't hate it. It's just not for her. And I don't expect her to listen to every single episode of this. There's going to be a lot of episodes where we're talking about The Witcher if we're going to do every chapter of every book, which is what I fully intend on doing. I'd be very impressed if she listened to every single episode, but she should be listening to at least this is only the third episode, so she should be still listening up to this point. So if she doesn't say anything, Mom, if you don't say anything, then I'll know. If you don't say anything about the blanket I mentioned, I'll know that you are not actually listening. So yeah, this is a good test. Anyway, so we'll start out the episode with a recap from the latest chapter, so the chapter prior to the one that we're going to be talking today, just so that you can get caught up if you haven't listened to the last one recently, or if you missed it and you haven't listened at all and you just want to start here. So, the latest chapter began with Geralt waking up in bed with a silent priestess in the Temple of Melitele. He's currently staying there to be treated from striga wounds, and he's being treated by his old friend, the temple's high priestess, Mother Nenneke. Nenneke tries to convince Geralt that allowing Iola, which is the name of the silent priestess he slept with, to perform a trance on him, it might be a good thing, but he's skeptical that it'll have any effect. From there, the chapter moved into the short story, A Grain of Truth, where Geralt met a cursed man named Nivellen, who had the appearance of a beast, a house that obeyed his commands, and a vampire lover named Verena. After Geralt realizes that Verena was a vampire and was wreaking havoc on Nivellen and anyone who wandered near the remote location surrounding Nivellen's house, Geralt slew the vampire and reversed Nivellen's curse, returning him to his past human form. Alright, so now we'll go through the summary of the chapter we're talking about today, chapter 3. So chapter 3 of The Last Wish begins with Geralt and Nenneke having an unpleasant discussion with two members of an order known as the White Rose. The two members, Falwick and Talus, have come to Nenneke's temple to demand, on behalf of Ellender's Duke Hereward, that Geralt departs the land immediately. Geralt and Nenneke try to reason with the knights, saying that Geralt is only in town for personal matters, and he'll be leaving in only 3 days, but they don't care why he's there, and they want him gone now. From here, the chapter's flashback story titled The Lesser Evil begins. Geralt has just arrived in the town of Blaviken with a donkey pulling a cart carrying a dead monster called a Kikimora. He's bringing the monster carcass to the town alderman to find out if there's a reward, as this is how Geralt, a witcher, makes his living. He arrives at the alderman's house, his friend by the name of Caldamine, who gives him the disappointing news that there's no reward. One of the town guards, however, reminds Caldamine that the town wizard Irian might offer Geralt something for it. They bring the dead Kikimora to the wizard's tower, where they announce themselves through a magic intercom system. The wizard isn't interested in the Kikimora, but is very interested in welcoming Geralt into the tower. Geralt enters to discover that the wizard isn't actually called Irian, but it's a wizard from his past named Stregobor. Stregobor and Geralt know each other from a time when Geralt tried to receive a reward from the king of Kovir for killing a monster, until Stregobor convinced the king that Geralt was a thoughtless killing machine, which then resulted in the king not only refusing to pay Geralt, but also giving him very little time to leave the country before having him executed. Basically, Geralt doesn't have fond memories of Stregobor. Although Geralt doesn't think very highly of him, the wizard asks the Witcher for his help in defending him from a monster who's after him. Before describing the monster in particular, Stregobor provides some background on the curse of the Black Sun. The Black Sun, according to Stregobor, is a solar eclipse that would announce the return of a goddess, Lilith, and the extermination of the human race, and Lilith's path would be paved by 60 women who would fill the river valleys with blood. Stregobor and other mages who believed this prophecy began to kill and autopsy girls born during or closely after the solar eclipse, until they eventually realized they were making some mistakes in choosing the girls, so they instead started to isolate them in towers. They believe the girls to be mutated and to have been prone to cruelty, aggression, and sudden fits of rage. There are some people, such as Geralt, who think the prophecy is nonsense, and it was just an excuse for mages to manipulate crowned officials more than they already do by breaking up marriage alliances or any other kind of alliances. One of the girls in particular, a banished princess called Renfri, is the quote-unquote monster that is currently after Stregobor. Renfri is seeking revenge on Stregobor for his part in assisting her stepmother, Iridia, in attempting to have her killed. Geralt dismisses the curse in this particular situation as Iridia trying to get Renfri out of the way, as she would prefer to have her own children inherit the throne, since she's Renfri's stepmother, and she has her own children that are not stepchildren. Stregobor has been trying to escape from Renfri's revenge for some time, moving from place to place and using magic to cover his tracks, but she always manages to find him, another characteristic of her mutation, Stregobor believes. She's recently arrived in Blaviken, so Stregobor asks Geralt to kill her, to which Geralt refuses since he's not in the business of killing humans for pay, especially when he finds the whole curse of the Black Sun to be nonsense anyway. Stregobor claims killing her would be the lesser evil, but Geralt asserts that if he has to choose between one evil and another, he'd prefer not to choose at all. Geralt leaves Stregobor's tower and meets back up with Caldamine at a local inn, where they try to find Renfri and the gang of 6 men she showed up with in Blaviken. Geralt finds the men seated at a table in an alcove where he approaches them, letting them know he'd like to talk to Renfri. They're extremely hostile, and right before a fight breaks out, Renfri presents herself. She, Geralt, and Caldamine have a short discussion where the alderman warns her to leave Blaviken with her companions, or he'll have them all imprisoned. Renfri presents him with a letter from the king stating that anyone who mistreats her will endure his wrath. To that, Caldamine says that if she does end up breaking the law, he'll have her imprisoned. When Geralt returns to the alderman's home where he's staying, he's about to enter his attic room where he notices someone is already in there waiting for him. It's Renfri, who climbed across rooftops to sneak in and talk to Geralt about how she'd like him to kill Stregobor, as Geralt is the only one Stregobor will let into his tower. She also claims killing him would be the lesser evil, as there would be less bloodshed in Blaviken. She talks about the horrible experiences she had after the wizard and her stepmother tried to have her killed, while she lived as a wanderer, but it isn't enough to persuade Geralt to kill Stregobor. He just wants to remain neutral. Geralt convinces her to take her gang and leave Blaviken in the morning. The two spend the night together, and the next morning, Geralt tells Caldemine that they'll be leaving peacefully. During their discussion, however, Caldemine mentions something that leads Geralt to recall a part of his conversation with Renfri last night and realize that they aren't actually leaving Blaviken. Renfri lied, and they're going to take advantage of Blaviken's market day and start killing civilians in the street until Stregobor decides to leave his tower and submit to Renfri. He tells his friend to gather the town guards, but Caldemine insists that nothing can be done. With the paper Renfri had issued from the king, he cannot actually do anything to her and her crew, even if they commit any crimes. Geralt doesn't care. Even when his friend, the alderman, forbids him from interfering, Geralt heads to the market to stop them. When he arrives, the 6 men of Renfri's gang are waiting for him. They try to attack Geralt, but he manages to defend himself and kills all 6 of them. Renfri arrives at the scene to see her friends dead. She says Stregobor refused to leave his tower even if they killed the whole town, and that he wouldn't even let Geralt in. He urges her to leave, but she declines and draws her sword. He tries to use a Witcher sign to will her to go, but the magic has no impact on her, and the two cross swords. The fight, albeit more difficult than the fight with all 6 men, ends with a victorious Geralt and a dead Renfri. Stregobor now arrives at the scene, saying he saw what happened from his crystal ball. He tells Geralt to bring a cart so they can take her body to be autopsied, but Geralt, surprising himself even, threatens to kill Stregobor if he touches her. Stregobor backs down and says he's heading back to Kovir and that Geralt should leave with him since the people of Blaviken only know what they saw, which was him slaughtering 7 people in the street. He refuses, and the townspeople start to throw stones at him, which he blocks with a Witcher sign. And it's probably Quen from the last chapter, since it acts as a shield. The alderman shows up and tells everyone to stop, and also tells Geralt to leave and never come back. So, my very first thought after I read this story was, is the curse of the Black Sun real or not? And we really don't know. So I put together in my notes here some points that argue the legitimacy of the curse of the Black Sun, and then some points that you could use to argue that it's BS. So for things pointing to it being real, first thing I have is Stregobor was present for an autopsy done on one of these girls. He said that she had a 6-chambered heart, missing organs. Some of the organs were not in the right places, moving cilia throughout the body. And I honestly don't think that Stregobor lied about this. And I don't really know a good way that you could explain what happened there, aside from the curse being real. And I don't think that Stregobor lied because he knows Geralt, and he knows that Geralt's not stupid, and he's not somebody that you can just lie to and get away with it. I think he knows that Geralt's wise enough to be able to see through some easy lies. So that's one thing that we don't really get an explanation for, aside from it really being the curse. Something else was that Stregobor tells Geralt that a lot of the girls showed signs of the gift of clairvoyance. We see this firsthand in the story. So he tells Geralt that, and then when Geralt and Renfri are in the attic room talking, she has a little episode of showing signs of clairvoyance. They're sitting there and the discussion gets weird. So even the things that Geralt says are kind of strange, like some of the questions he starts asking her are weird. So she says things like, you're standing on a flagstone covered in blood and you've made a choice and you'll never know if it was the right one. And it's just kind of random. It kind of comes out of nowhere in the discussion that they're having. And he doesn't even really seem that confused about it, which I thought was weird. But she says that, and that right there shows you, because Geralt was on these flagstones that were covered in blood after he killed all 7 of them. And he made a choice, choosing to try and stop Renfri and her comrades. And she also says, or he asks her, he says, who are you? And she says, I am what I am. And then the next day, when Geralt goes to the market to stop all of them, the 6 guys are there, and they pass on a message from Renfri to Geralt before she shows up, or before she gets the chance to show up. And that's one of the things that was part of her message to Geralt, was like, I am what I am. Which, I mean, you could always just argue that she said, that wasn't, anything that had to do with being able to predict the future or have psychic powers. But he also says, where are you? Another question I thought was so strange. But then she says, I'm cold. And that's something she says right after Geralt gets her, when they're having their sword fight. She's on the ground, and she says to Geralt, she's trying to get Geralt to come over and comfort her, because what you find out right after she takes her last breath, she drops a little dagger that she was kind of hiding underneath her body. So she says, like, Geralt, hold me. And she says, I'm cold. And, she really just wanted Geralt to come to her so that as she's dying, she could kill him really quick. And, yeah, so that was another thing. Like, it's kind of hard to explain that one away. Also, being impervious to magic. So Geralt tells Stregobor this is impossible, but he later sees firsthand that it's not. He tries to use one of his Witcher signs on Renfri, and right before they fight, to try to get her to leave, and it just doesn't have any effect on her. So if Geralt, a skeptic of the curse's legitimacy, is later proved wrong about the possibility of magic resistance, then other things he was skeptical about could turn out to be true as well. So, we have, during the conversation between Stregobor and Geralt, we have Geralt being very dismissive of the whole thing the entire time. He thinks it's nonsense. And I feel like it's written in a way so that you're inclined to agree with him. I think also you're just inclined to agree with him because he's the protagonist, and so far throughout this book, we get to know him more than anybody else. We like him. We want to agree with him. So if he's saying something like that, then we're gonna kind of just go with whatever he's saying. And Stregobor comes across as kind of like an overzealous lunatic, a little bit. I mean, overzealous, yeah, but a lunatic just a little bit. He might be, who knows. But yeah, I guess what I'm just trying to say here is that just because Geralt says it's true or not true doesn't really mean that it is what he says. And then the last point that I have as to why the Curse of the Black Sun could be a real thing is this is a world where magic and curses exist, as we've seen so far. We're not that far into the story, into the whole story of The Witcher. And we've seen at least 2 curses at this point, Nivellen and the Striga. We've seen magic. So it's really not unlikely that something like this would be real in this world. If somebody came to me in our real world, in real life, and told me about a curse, or girls being born during an eclipse were cursed and had these mutations and basically everything that they say these girls in the Witcher story had, I would think that they were crazy and I wouldn't believe it at all. But it's not that far out of a theory in the Witcher world. But it could be nonsense. Some of the things could be maybe kind of explained away, and I'll get to that right now. So, well, the first thing is that the whole story of the Curse of the Black Sun, Geralt says that Eltibald was mad, and Eltibald was the wizard who originally started the whole mania of the Curse of the Black Sun. He was the mage that got this whole thing going, and Geralt thinks that the guy was just crazy. And Stregobor says, no, he wasn't crazy. He wasn't mad. Like, it's real. But maybe he was. We don't know. He also thinks that the mutations, Geralt that is, thinks that the mutations could have been a result of magic. So this is something that could kind of explain away some of the points that I did recently talk about, like the abnormal autopsy and the clairvoyance and the resistance to magic. So the people who were experimenting and dealing with these girls who were quote unquote cursed were mages. They were people that practiced magic, and they could have been doing magic things to these girls that could have actually changed them, changed their anatomy. It could have given them some magic powers themselves, probably unintentionally. I don't think that they were doing that just so that they could claim that the girls actually were cursed and mutated, but that might be part of it. We really don't know enough about magic to be able to come to that decision one way or the other, and I don't know if we'll ever learn enough throughout the story to be able to decide, but it's just another thing that you could consider when it comes to what you want to believe at the end of the story. Geralt says that, this is a quote, he says, "You can say that about any woman," when Stregobor argues the girls had a tendency to cruelty and aggression, which, I mean, it's kind of like a sexist thing to say, but I mean, you could say that about any person, you know. Nobody's perfect. People are going to show signs of aggression and cruelty from time to time, you know, some people more than others. But I think basically the point that Geralt makes is that just because they showed signs of cruelty and aggression doesn't mean that they were cursed. It could just be a person being a person. And then I want to kind of come back to this point in my next one, which is that the girls who were freed from the towers, so some of these girls were in prison in towers, they were isolated, and some of them were freed. There was this craze of these princes trying to rescue the girls from towers. Some of them that were successfully freed committed crimes later. Stregobor gives some examples of them just wreaking havoc on these countries and doing a lot of bad things. But could that be a result of how they were treated? Is that kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy where somebody treats you like you're a cruel, vicious monster your whole life? You might end up becoming that because of how you were treated. And I think that ties back to my last point too about, you know, when Stregobor was saying that the girls had a tendency to cruelty and aggression. You were treating them like they had that. But again, we don't know for sure. It's left ambiguous so that you can decide for yourself. What I had thought the first time that I read this, I still didn't think that it was real. I think I just wanted to side with Geralt. But after reading this chapter, I don't know, like 18 times in preparation for this episode of this podcast, I was left thinking that it might be real to an extent. I think that maybe some of it might be legit and some of it might be nonsense. I think some of it also might be like what I was just talking about, how, you know, the self-fulfilling prophecy, you get treated a certain way, you're eventually just going to start acting that way, even if you weren't acting that way when they started treating you like that. So I do think that some pieces of what were argued by Stregobor might be real. The clairvoyant thing, I think that there might be some legitimacy there. The resistance to magic, I don't know if that was a common thing with. They don't say that that was something that happened with all of the girls born during or after, or closely after the eclipse. I think that it might have just been Renfrey, but I mean, Renfrey was also once affected by magic, so maybe after Stregobor cursed her by turning her into a slab of mountain crystal, which sounds horrible. That's I left that out of the summary, but so if you haven't read it, there was a point where Renfrey saw Stregobor like out in the street somewhere, and she came at him with a sword, and he cursed her by turning her into a slab of mountain crystal. And then somebody found her and reversed the spell and turned her back into a person. And then from there on out, she was resistant to magic. So that also kind of goes along with, well, you were doing magic to them. That magic could have impacted these things that you found. But I don't know. Some of it, I think, could be possible. Maybe the whole thing with the autopsy with that was done on one of the girls with the six-chambered heart and the missing organs. Maybe that was part of the curse. But yeah, I don't know, and we'll never know for sure, which makes it more fun. So, moving on. Toward the beginning of the story, Geralt refuses to help Stregobor, claiming that evil is evil and that he'd rather not choose between different evils. But later, when he realizes Renfrey and her gang are going to repeat the Tridem ultimatum, he tells Caldomine that they have to stop them because it's the lesser evil. And really quick, I'll explain what the Tridem ultimatum is. So, Caldomine tells Geralt about this. He says that this is, or that it was one of the men in Renfrey's gang. He is a half-elf, and his name's Sivril. He was part of this ultimatum thing that happened in this, I don't know if it's a town or a region or a country, but it's called Tridem. And what happened was he had these, they call them brigands, that they were his comrades, him and a few other people, and they were imprisoned in this town. We'll just say it's a town. And they wanted them freed. They demanded to have them freed, and the Baron of this town refused. So they intercepted this ferry that had pilgrims on it. And I think there was over 25 pilgrims, and they started killing them. You know, they were telling them, if you don't release them from prison, if you don't release our friends from prison, we're going to keep killing. And eventually the Baron caved and he freed the brigands from prison, and they didn't end up killing all of the pilgrims on this ferry. So, just to provide you with some background on what that is. Why did Geralt change his tune? He says more than once he's not going to choose, or he's all about being neutral. So why did he change his tune? Well, when he hears the story from Stregobor's side, he doesn't want to choose because he doesn't believe the Curse of the Black Sun to be real. So he finds Stregobor, a participant in the witch hunts, to be deserving of Renfrey's revenge. And he doesn't want to get in the middle. You know, it's two different people's battle. He doesn't want to get involved in that, which is totally understandable. Also, he, as a witcher, isn't a hired thug, and just because he's good at killing doesn't mean he wants to get involved in human affairs. His perspective on Renfrey changes, though, when he realizes she's willing to slaughter an entire town of people. And see, I think that the thing is, most people would probably find this to be the lesser evil. So whether or not you want to remain neutral, I think most people would see somebody trying to kill an entire town's worth of innocent people that had nothing to do with anything involved with Renfrey and Stregobor. I think they would find that to be pretty abhorrent. And I think most people, if they had Geralt's physical capabilities, I think that they would want to interfere with that and try to prevent that from happening, because it's just horrible. So Geralt didn't want to choose, but like I mentioned in previous episodes, I think he's a good guy. And good people don't stand idly by and watch an entire town get slaughtered and do nothing, especially when you can do something. You're not going to just do nothing. So, something we kind of learn in this chapter, and I say kind of because maybe I'm just overthinking it, but we'll find out in the future if this is me overthinking it or if it's real. There seems to be a prejudice towards witchers. The White Rose from the very beginning of the chapter, when Geralt is at the temple with Neneke, the White Rose are trying to force Geralt to leave. They don't even know Geralt. Well, they've never met him until that moment, and they came there with the agenda of trying to force him out. Falwick, one of the knights, says, "Witchers attract trouble like a magnet filings." Don't know exactly what that means, but I can guess what he's saying is that he's making a generalization that witchers attract trouble. So that's already a red flag right there, that they're prejudiced against witchers. But maybe it's not a prejudice, because Tallis calls Geralt the Butcher of Blaviken. So at the beginning of the chapter, when we first read that, we don't know what this is in reference to, but we very quickly, by the time we're done with the whole chapter, we know what that means. And this is in a different area too, so he seems to have gained some infamy for what happened during the short story, and people clearly aren't happy about it. I mean, we saw that in the short story when people decided to try and start throwing stones at him, but even in a whole different region, people know about it, and they do not like him for it. So it's possible that maybe it really just has to do with that. Maybe they heard, oh, this guy, this witcher that is in town slaughtered 8 people, and like Stregobor tells Geralt, they don't know any of the backstory. They only know what they saw, and what they saw was you killing 7 people. So that's probably the rumor or the word that got spread around, was that he just killed 7 innocent people. No further context. So maybe that's all it is they think, okay, this guy's bad news, we gotta get him out of here. But we'll find out. We'll possibly find out in future chapters or future stories. So another thing I wanted to talk about was in the last chapter, chapter 2, I discussed how there were a lot of parallels, very obvious ones, between the short story A Grain of Truth and the story of Beauty and the Beast. So in this story, The Lesser Evil, we had some parallels between the story and Snow White. And there doesn't seem to be a parallel between the story as a whole of Snow White and then the story as a whole of The Lesser Evil, but there's just a few mentions throughout the chapter that show you the parallels. So one of them is there's a magic mirror. So if you're familiar with Snow White, and I'm just going to assume that you are, you know that there's a magic mirror, and Renfri's stepmother, Iridia, had a magic mirror that you could talk to and find out things from. Geralt says something about that mirror is, basically there to ask who the fairest of them all is. And Stregobor says that she actually would ask that mirror about like the good of the country, or like the health of her country. So either way though, it's definitely connected. The queen, Iridia, wanted Renfri dead. So just like in Snow White, the queen wanted Snow White dead. Another thing was the 7 gnomes. So for a period of time before the whole Blaviken thing, Renfrey had these comrades that were all gnomes, and there were 7 of them, just like the 7 dwarfs, and they were miners, just like the 7 dwarfs. I really liked that they added the detail about them being miners too. And then the last one, let me know if you found more parallels than what I have. But the last one was that Aridia and Stregobor tried to poison Renfrey at one point with a poison apple. So Renfrey says that they tried to give her an apple laced with nightshade. And she wasn't saved by a prince, but she was saved by a gnome. I guess one of those 7 gnomes. And she ended up surviving. But I like that. I think that's cool. It adds on to the story a little bit of what's already a really good story. So in this story and in this chapter, we get to know a little bit more about the Witcher world. So I just wanted to make note of some of these things. I think it's fun, and I also just like to have a mental note of it at the very least, just so I can kind of keep track of what this world is like, since it's a world different from our own. We learn of a monster called a Kikimora, and that was briefly mentioned in one of the first 2 stories. I can't remember which one, but it was very shortly mentioned. I think it was I think it was in A Grain of Truth when Geralt is trying to figure out who killed or what killed the armorer and his daughter that had recently tried to come to see Nivellen. And they or he mentions a Kikimora being one of the things that could have killed them, but then he quickly realizes that it couldn't have been because there's no swamps nearby. So Kikimora is a swamp monster, and we know it's got a similar body to a spider, just a lot larger. That sounds disgusting. Glad that is not real in our world. We learn a little bit more about the abilities of witchers. And I like to note this in each episode. I've at least done that so far. But one thing I mentioned in one of the first 2 episodes was some of the Witcher abilities we learn about. We don't know 100% that all Witchers can do these things, or if Geralt is just very exceptional. But either way, I'll mention the things that I have noted. So the first one is that Geralt was able to hit a rat with a fork in the dark. And with that explanation in the book, we also have more proof of Witchers having the capability of real human feelings, because Geralt says he thought that doing that, hitting the rat with the fork in the dark, would be amusing. And I don't think people who don't have human feelings would be seeking amusement. And also, Geralt deflects a crossbow bolt in midair. So that's definitely not a normal human thing that can be done. Not that I know of, at least. So that is something else that we learn. And again, I don't know if that's just Geralt or if all Witchers can do that. We also get to learn about more Witcher signs. One is probably Quen. So when Geralt kills Renfrey and her men, and the people of Blaviken try to start throwing stones at him, he uses a Witcher sign to hold up a shield. And I think it's Quen because in the last chapter he uses that, and it describes it as being like a shield. And then he also uses a sign to try and control people's willpower. And he tries to do this to Renfrey, and it's unsuccessful. Neither of these are identified, though, in the story, so I don't know exactly what they are. But I think the first one's Quen. The second one we saw in the very first story, at the very beginning of the first story, when he's in the tavern in Wiseham, and then the guards come to get him because he just killed those men. Oh, this is the second time Geralt's killed some people. I mean, these people were up to no good, but I just had that realization now that he's done that a couple of times now when we're only into the 3rd chapter. So anyway, but yeah, they don't tell us what the name of that sign is. and they don't tell us again in this chapter. But I'm curious what it's called. And I'm also curious if we have learned about all of the Witcher signs up to this point. But if we do get more, I will be sure to point them out in future episodes. We learn that Witchers and wizards don't love each other. And it seems like wizards tend to advocate for preserving monsters because they're endangered, and they only kill because they're hungry. So that's something that we find out for sure with Stregobor. He tries to convince the king of Kovir not to give Geralt any reward for killing a monster. And that's obviously very conflicting with somebody whose job is to kill monsters. So if that is a common trait with wizards, then it doesn't, or then it does make sense that they're not going to be big fans of one another, and they're going to have a lot of conflicting ideologies. And then we are also introduced to more magic in this story. So inside of Stregobor's tower, it was a big illusion, having the appearance of being outside in an orchard with food that you can actually eat and flowers that you can actually smell, and a naked woman that you could actually, they don't tell us what you can actually do with her, but we can guess, and I'll just leave it at that. And wizards can also turn people into slabs of mountain crystal. That one's not very nice magic. I did not like that one. Like that one wasn't a fun, exciting one. It's pretty crazy though. I wouldn't picture that being like the first. I mean, if I was a wizard and and somebody was after me, trying to kill me, and I mean, maybe they don't have a lot of things that they can, a lot of options for what they can turn people into at a moment's notice, but I just can't imagine that that would be the first thing I would go to, is a slab of mountain crystal. But I mean, it protected him for a little bit, so I mean, until somebody reversed the spell. But just, I don't know, so I thought it was kind of random. But yeah, that's another piece of magic we learn about that is that mages are capable of in the Witcher world. All right, so to conclude this episode, the Knights of the White Rose didn't seem satisfied with Geralt's declaration to leave in 3 days instead of immediately. Talis said they'll return, and that was probably not going to end well. But Nenneke firmly has Geralt's back. She confidently told them that they're unwelcome and even threatened Talis at one point during their discussion with a jar. So she would throw a jar at his feet, and she said when it explodes, she doesn't know if it would cause his lungs to burst or if it would cause him to grow fur, or maybe even both. So the two of them together, Nenneke and Geralt, seem to be like a pretty good team. I mean, although Geralt is in the process of healing from getting his throat almost completely cut open, so maybe he's not really in the best shape right now to be fighting people, but hopefully these knights come to listen to reason, or maybe they have some people in charge of them that are going to put them in their place, although it doesn't seem like it. It seems like whoever is in charge and making these decisions is probably also not okay with Geralt being in this area. But I still, yeah, I don't have high hopes for those knights if they try to interfere with them. There's not really a whole lot that we can take from the short story itself. So the bits of the chapter that are going in chronological order, and I don't think I mentioned this at all yet so far in any episode, so I'll say this now. They're all titled, God, what is it? After reading it so many times, you'd think I'd be able to remember it right off the top of my head. I got the book right here, just for this reason. The Voice of Reason. I didn't even get to the page yet, and it came to me. So, yeah, in between every short story is a little bit of the chapter called The Voice of Reason. And that's where Geralt's at this temple with Neneke, and there's the silent priestess named Iola, and the stuff with the white rose is going on. So that's the only part that's kind of going in chronological order that we know we're going to read more about in following chapters. So anything that we read in these short stories, we don't know how much it's going to apply to any future plot points. So there's not really a whole lot that I can say about the story The Lesser Evil that I can use to make guesses about what is to come, or to wonder what might come after that. Although we do know that Geralt received some infamy from the story The Lesser Evil. People are calling him the Butcher of Blaviken. But I still am interested in reading more stories. Obviously I am. But I think that the stories are so good that you are left wanting to continue reading more. And I think that's pretty cool. But eventually we're going to get to the first book of the main series, where every chapter is written out like, in chronological order. It's written like a regular book is written. So once we get to that point, we can have more things to discuss of what we would like to see or find out about in future chapters. But until then, it's going to be just a little bit of stuff about those the Voice of Reason chapters. And yeah, I think that is all I have to say. I kind of rambled on at the end there for a minute, but I think I made my point clear. So yeah, if you've listened this far, I really appreciate it. I have this podcast available at this time. You can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and my YouTube channel. I'm going to see if I can expand that a little bit more. I think I can, but as of right now, those are the only 3 places. Well, at least at the time of posting my first episode, because right now, recording this, I have only posted 1 episode so far. Anyway, again, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.